Okay, so thank you for bearing with me while I deal with my springtime hay fever here. Trust me when I tell you that, again, if you've never sneezed into a mask before, it will ruin your day. It's not something you want to spend a lot of time doing. So with that said, let's go on ahead and get through what we need to get through today. Where we're going to start is where we left off. We're talking about vitamins. And in particular, we had talked about kind of the role of vitamins, but we hadn't really talked about some of the things that they do, right? So one of the things that they do is they're responsible for, particularly vitamins C, E, and A, are what we call antioxidants. And what they are there to do is neutralize free radicals. Now, the term antioxidant, sorry, cough drop. The term antioxidant and the term free radical are probably terms you've heard before, but probably no one has ever explained to you what they actually are. What they are, right, is free radical anyway, is the normal byproduct of the breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide and water. Typically, right, we go through this whole big long process whereby we hand off electrons, yada, yada, yada. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the idea, right, is that all of the molecules from all the atoms from glucose are accounted for when we make H2O and CO2. However, there are some times when one of those oxygen molecules doesn't get paired up, okay, and it's just a single O. And the issue with that is that a single oxygen atom is very clingy. It likes to bind to anything. It really does not want to be alone. That's why we usually only ever find oxygen in the form of O2, right? Oxygen gas. So that free radical then will bind to anything that's in its vicinity, including your DNA. And when it binds to your DNA, excuse me, when it binds to your DNA, that can be a problem, right? That can lead to cancers and all other sorts of things. So what an antioxidant does is it's basically just a sacrificial lamb, so to speak, and it will bind to that free oxygen, that free radical, and thus prevent damage to your DNA or to other structures within there. In terms of where you're going to get these, right? Again, we look particularly for vitamins A and C. Your cruciform vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, actually all the same plant, believe it or not. But those are really, really good natural sources of vitamins A and C. And then, of course, citrus fruits are also good places to find vitamin C. Minerals are like vitamins, things we need in a little bit, right, but not a huge amount. Unlike vitamins, these are inorganic. These are not produced by living organisms. These are inorganic, abiotic things out in the world. 7 of them are reasonably important. So calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. There are some others out there that we need, of course, but those really are the big 7. For example, here, right, we use calcium and phosphorus, and to a lesser extent magnesium for bone. Right. Iron, obviously, we spent an entire chapter talking about why we need iron for hemoglobin. Sodium and chloride are major electrolytes in the blood, like that. Where we're going to get these minerals from, vegetables in particular. So any plant part, root, a stem, a leaf, these are going to be taking up minerals from the soil. And so they'll have a lot of minerals within them. Legumes, as far as seeds in particular, are, again, fairly mineral rich. And then animal products. Milk, especially, is a good source of things like calcium, right? You can also buy vitamin D milk. You get vitamin D in there as well with that. And then some meats, particularly organ meats, are going to be mineral rich, more so than, say, skeletal muscle a little bit. All right. Now, what are we going to do with all these different nutrients? Again, the very beginning of the chapter, we had said the big thing here that we're going to do is we are going to use most of this stuff for energy, right? And that really is what metabolism kind of is all about, right? Particularly the idea of catabolic metabolism or catabolism, where we take things like glucose and we break them down into pyruvic acid, and then we take that pyruvic acid and break it down further, eventually into its individual components, and we can slap them back together with water and oxygen, or with oxygen to make water and carbon dioxide, all these wonderful things. We can also, of course, build things instead, right? So instead of being catabolic and breaking things down, we can be anabolic and building things up, right? So the production of new proteins from amino acids in our diet, things of that nature. We talked about the term cellular respiration. It has a distinct definition apart from what we talked about when we talked about external and internal respiration, the respiratory system. Cellular respiration is the breakdown of things like glucose to produce ATP as an end result. And the reason that ATP is so useful for us, okay, is that ATP basically has 3 phosphate bonds, adenosine triphosphate. And the reason those are so important is that a phosphate bond holds a lot of energy in it, right? You can kind of think of a phosphate bond as, well, as money, right? It's like a $100 bill or something, right? And what we're going to do with this ATP is we're going to hand out those $100 bills to parts of your body that need to do work, okay? This process is called phosphorylation. When we give one of those phosphates and its phosphate bond to another molecule so that it can do its job. For our purposes here, we're going to think about there being basically 3 stages in the processing of nutrients, 4 metabolic processes. The first one here we've already talked about with the digestive system. So digestion, absorption, and transport. Here, kind of calling back a little bit to what we talked about in ANP1, okay? This idea of cellular processing, which is the making of things, so synthesis of. So in the smooth ER, right, we're manufacturing new lipids, new fats. In the rough ER, we're making new proteins. In various parts of the, particularly the liver, we might be manufacturing glycogen, okay, from glucose. And at the same time, right, we're going to be also doing catabolic activities here, particularly glycolysis, which we've touched on before, but we'll talk about some more today. Where we take a glucose molecule and break it down into 2 pyruvic acids, and eventually convert each of those pyruvic acids into a third molecule here called acetyl coenzyme A, and we will spend some time with why that's important today also. The third stage here is the in the presence of oxygen, so in mitochondria, right, we're going to have the breakdown of things like acetyl coenzyme A and its sort of continuation products here into carbon dioxide and water, right, our waste products, and ATP from there. And the goal here ultimately is to trap as much of that energy in the food that we ate in the form of phosphate bonds, in the form of ATP. Now that's energy that we can use right away, right? That's energy that's available to us right off the bat. We're also going to have energy stored in forms that we can eventually convert to ATP, but are going to require a little more work. So when we take glucose molecules and we anabolically slap them together to make glycogen, we take glycogen and we convert it to fat, okay? Those are other means of energy storage. But eventually, from all of those different processes, we can, of course, again, come back and reconvert that back and eventually turn it into ATP. So the whole process, right, of cellular respiration, if we kind of work our way through it, is going to involve glycolysis, something called the Krebs cycle, or sometimes the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain, oxidative phosphorylation, whatever you want to call it. And we're gonna talk about each of these, but we're gonna take a really simplified view of things. So if you've had cell biology or things like that, you might have gone into more depth in these things. We're gonna keep it as low key as possible here. So if we kind of pull back and take kind of a holistic view of what's going on here, right? Pulling in stuff from the last chapter we were at, in the digestive system chapter we've got, right, our three major nutrients here: proteins, carbs, and fats. The breakdown product, the digestive product of each of these here is going to be amino acids from proteins, glucose, other sugars from carbs, and fatty acids and glycerol from fats, typically. Now, what happens at this point, right, is where things start to get a little bit hairy. We can, of course, find a way to turn each of these things, an amino acid, glucose, a fatty acid, glycerol, into this intermediary here, acetyl coenzyme A. And that's why acetyl coenzyme A is so important, right? If we're talking about needing to convert from one form to another, right, some carbs to fats or fats to carbs, or proteins to carbs for that matter, all of these pathways converge or come together at acetyl coenzyme A. So if we want to take, say, a carb and turn it into a fat, what we're going to do is we're going to take our glucose, we're going to break it into glycogen, or break it into 2 pyruvic acids. Okay, so our blue arrows here are catabolic processes. We're going to take that pyruvic acid and convert it to acetyl coenzyme A. And then we can take that acetyl coenzyme A and go backwards, right, and turn it into a fatty acid. And then with a fatty acid plus a glycerol, we can turn it into a fat again, right? Or if we want to go the opposite direction, right, and say we want to take an amino acid and turn it into a carb, again, the processing here, we turn an amino acid into acetyl coenzyme A, we turn acetyl coenzyme A back into pyruvic acid, and we take 2 pyruvic acids, we slap them together, and we make glucose out of that. So it's very, very, very important, right, as a intermediary, as a step in the process of converting and breaking down each of these 3 major nutrients. They all will converge on that, which is really important. Okay. However, right, if we're not interested in converting a carb to a fat or a fat to a protein or whatever, right, we're simply interested in making ATP, what we're going to do then is we're going to take that acetyl coenzyme A and we're going to throw it into the Krebs cycle, okay, or the citric acid cycle. They're both the same thing, basically, right? And what the Krebs cycle is going to do is it's going to convert this acetyl coenzyme A into a bunch of different things. We're going to take some of the energy and we're going to reduce FAD to FADH2 and NAD to NADH and yada, 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 yada. Things that we don't need to worry about, right? But the important part about this, right, is that all of these intermediary steps we can then put into, or will occur in, the mitochondria, where we basically hand a hydrogen ion, right, and its electron that's sort of orbiting it. We hand them off from piece to piece to piece to piece through a series of different enzymes. And along the way, we're generating a gradient that we can use to make ATP, right? And at the end of it, our final reason, and this is the reason we need oxygen, that H, right, that hydrogen ion has to go somewhere, right? And so we have oxygen gas here. That's our electron acceptor. We take this hydrogen ion and we hand it off and we make water out of 2 hydrogens and 1 of these 2 oxygens. Okay, so this is basically how that pathway written out for carbs. So we have glucose C6H12O6 plus oxygen in the mitochondria, kicks us out 6 water, 6 carbon dioxide. And so you'll see these numbers balance, right? They are all the same number of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen here as is over here. We're also going to produce 32-ish ATP, and of course some heat, right? And in order to go through that, right, that's going to be where each of these three pathways, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, are all going to play a role for us. Okay, so where do these things happen? Again, real simple. We're going to try to keep this as simple as possible here. Okay, glycolysis happens just in the cell. All right, the Krebs cycle sometimes happens in the mitochondria. In other animals, it doesn't necessarily happen there, but in humans, typically, we're talking about it in the mitochondria, as well as the electron transport chain, again, happening in the mitochondria. The only part of this that we actually really need here is just this last little bit right there. You know, excuse me, my dog just threw up, so I have to pause this. I will be right back. Life is ever so amazing when you're home. Okay. Okay. I can't decide if I was glad to be home to catch that or not. I honestly don't know. Anyway, so electron transport chain here, the final part of this is going to be where, again, we kind of have a big long process, so we're not going to get into, but this is where we need the oxygen for. Outside of this, we don't really need it. It's really just there to be the final place to drop off those hydrogen ions so that we can get rid of them in a safe way. Now, if you want to get into more detail, excuse me, absolutely, you can. You may have done this in other classes. You might be doing this in other classes in the future. So I'm going to show this to you, but I'm not going to make you guys worry about this sort of stuff. Okay. What is worthwhile, though, however, right? Sorry, again, cough drop, is that we're going to take one glucose and through these three processes, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, make somewhere in the neighborhood of 32 molecules of ATP. We don't actually know how many we actually net out of the whole thing, how many we actually get, because there is some cost associated with doing this. We don't know how much that cost is. So we estimate somewhere, again, around 30 to 32 is a good round number for that. Okay. So in addition to using glucose to produce ATP through cellular respiration, we can also take glucose through a couple of different sort of catabolic and anabolic processes. One of those processes, a anabolic process, is what we call glycogenesis, right? And this is where we're going to manufacture or make glycogen, okay, so that we can have it for longer term storage. Right? Glucose is very water soluble. It's not stable over the long term. So if we're not going to use it in the next hour or two, we're probably going to convert it to glycogen first. And that's going to occur primarily in the skeletal muscles, liver. It can happen in other places, but that's really kind of the two primary places we expect to find it. And then when we do need that glycogen, we're going to go through, or glucose rather, we're going to go through this process here, glycogenolysis, where we're going to take glycogen and we're going to break it. So this is a catabolic process. We take glycogen and we're going to break it down into glucose. Right? And that's going to allow us to make pull glucose back out from this stored glycogen. I'm not too worried about this. We can just kind of skip this. Okay. You might have heard the term carbo loading before. Carbo loading is when, for a couple of days, you don't want to start too early, you don't want to start too late. So 3, maybe 4 days at the outside. You're going to eat a lot of carbs. You're not going to move around a whole lot. And the idea behind doing this is that you're going to start taking all this extra glucose and you're going to store it as glycogen. Okay. And because your muscles are a place that also use, that also go through glycogenesis, we're going to make a lot of glycogen. We're going to store that glycogen in the skeletal muscles. and it's going to be ready for you in the 3 or 4 days later when you're actually in the competition. There's all of this stored glycogen in those muscles. You can pull it off real quick and have increased endurance at that point. The reason you don't want to start doing this more than maybe 3 or 4 days in advance is that after about 3 or 4 days, we start taking that glycogen and we start storing it as fat. Now, another process that we can use where we can put glucose through, it's called gluconeogenesis. And gluconeogenesis is something that's going to happen kind of under the same conditions we expect to find glycogenolysis. When we have low blood sugar levels, we need to find glucose from somewhere. We're going to start by trying to pull it out of glycogen. If we can't do that efficiently enough, we're going to make new glucose. And that's what gluconeogenesis is about. And what we're going to do with that, kind of go back here, sorry, I went the wrong direction, go back to here, is we're going to take proteins or fats, preferentially fats here, and we're going to break them down, okay, to acetyl coenzyme A, right, in the case of the fatty acids, or to pyruvic acid in the case of glycerol. And we're going to take both of those products and go backwards, right, and slap them together and make glucose out of it. We can do that for proteins too, but we would prefer to do it with fats. And the reason that we're going to do that, right, if you remember, your central nervous system, your nervous system period, can't do anything without glucose. It requires glucose. And so if you are running dangerously low on glucose, this is one of those ways that we can kind of prevent your nervous system from shutting down, which is, of course, a good thing. Second, kind of in terms of importance here, to carbohydrate metabolism is lipid metabolism. Lipid metabolism is kind of a curious thing because on the face of it, you'd wonder why we don't do that instead of carbs. We get a lot more energy out of fats by unit mass, by gram or kilogram or whatever, than we do out of carbs, like a lot, right? It's more than double the amount of caloric energy in fats, right, per unit mass. The reason that we don't do this exclusively, the reason that we use carbohydrates, is that carbohydrates are easier to work with. There's a lot more energy cost associated with converting lipids into a form that we can use. And so while there's more energy in the raw fat than there is in the raw carb, the cost is also significantly higher. And so it's actually more cost efficient to use glucose instead of fats. However, as a storage medium, right, it's extremely efficient, right, because we don't have to make a lot of mass out of it to have a lot of energy stored in it. So from that perspective, it makes a ton of sense why we would use fats in the way that we do and we use carbs in the way that we do. If we're going to break down fats into their sort of useful parts for metabolic purposes, the first thing we're going to do, right, and we're talking here exclusively about triglycerides, right? We're going to take the 3 fatty acid chains, we're going to snap them off the glycerol backbone, okay? So we've got fatty acids on one hand and a glycerol molecule on the other now. This is because to work with cholesterol in a metabolic way is just it's not something we're equipped to do, okay? We really only ever use triglycerides for this. And once we do that, once we take the triglyceride and we break it down into the fatty acid and the glycerol, now we have 2 separate pathways to eventually produce ATP using the energy stored within them. These are, of course, the glycerol pathway and the fatty acid pathway. Glycerol pathway is very simple. Glycerol, glucose, extremely similar molecules, okay? So what we're going to do with glycerol is we're going to convert it to 1 pyruvic acid. Okay, now remember with glucose, we made 2 pyruvic acids from 1 glucose. With glycerol, we only get 1. So we have half as much ATP out of a glycerol as we do out of a glucose. So if we make 30 from a glucose molecule, we go through the whole process, we're only going to make 15 from a glycerol. Okay, but remember, we're not done. Right, we still have those 3 fatty acids there as well. Fatty acids get converted down a couple of different times. They get converted to acetic acid, and from acetic acid to acetyl coenzyme A. Okay, and from there they enter the Krebs cycle, and we can go on and proceed as normal. So it's really not terrible different, if we're being perfectly honest with you, right? If glycolysis and the glucose pathway is here, right, from here to there to there to there to there to there, the fat pathway is we're just kind of coming in from the side, right? There's a couple more steps, a little bit more effort, a little bit more cost, right? We have to break the triglyceride down first, and then we have to convert the glycerol to pyruvic acid, and then we can move forward, take the fatty acids, convert those to acetyl coenzyme A, and then we can move forward. So it's a little more work, but it's something we can do. Now, something we touched on before when we talked about glucose is the idea that over the long term, glucose isn't stable for more than a couple of days, a couple of hours. Glycogen is not stable for more than a couple of days. So if we're going to have long-term storage, right, we're going to keep the energy around, not simply just lose it, we're going to have to find another form, and that form, of course, is fats. And this is what lipogenesis is, the making of fats. If, on the other hand, and I'm not super worried about this, really just the general idea here, that we can, because of that midpoint, that acetyl coenzyme A midpoint allows us to kind of convert in between things. Lipogenesis is just using that acetyl coenzyme endpoint to take a sugar and turn it into fat. That's all it is. It's really all it is. Then, right, if we need to go the other direction, you take fats and make them into carbs, or into forms that we can use for energy. Rather than lipogenesis, we have lipolysis. Now there's another little thing in here, oxaloacetic acid. Oxaloacetic acid is kind of an interesting thing. You do require it to fully break down fat. If you lack oxaloacetic acid, you instead go through a process called ketogenesis, and you make ketone bodies, which are normal breakdown products of fat in the absence of oxaloacetic acid, but in sufficient quantities can actually be quite dangerous for you. Keto diets and things like that are designed around getting you into ketosis, where you produce a ton of these ketone bodies. And like most things that you'll read at a magazine on the grocery store checkout lane, it's really not a very healthy way to go about doing a diet. And in fact, if done improperly, which again, supermarket magazine advice here, odds are pretty good. If done improperly, it can make you really quite sick. What's going to happen here is you're going to get into this state of ketosis, right? Ketosis here is a sign of starvation. The reason that keto diets exist, right, is the idea that, oh, we're burning fat, right? Well, in a starvation kind of diet, you're using fat as kind of your exclusive fuel here. The downside to this, of course, is that it's also putting you in all these other starvation kind of positions that you don't want to be in. It's just not a good plan. Finally, here with proteins, generally speaking, protein metabolism is pretty simple, right? Most of what we talk about with protein metabolism is simply rebuilding or repairing broken down proteins, or if we're still growing, making new ones to make new parts of the body. Now, one of the things we talked about is that amino acids are not stored, right? We don't let them hang around. We don't have them in a form that we need. So we're going to burn them for fuel, or we're going to excrete them. That said, when we break down an old protein, we don't just throw up our hands and say, well, this is a waste product. We take those amino acids and we recycle them. So we oftentimes rebuild out of the broken down products of the old one. Part of the reason that our protein requirements are not nearly so high as you might otherwise imagine. When we talk about anabolic processes, building processes, right? Again, this is what amino acids are for. We're building new proteins, we're building structures, we're producing new enzymes, we're making stuff, right? But again, remember, all or none rule. If we don't have one of those 475 amino acids we need, we're out of luck, right? So you're going to need, again, to make sure that in the diet, you've got all of those essential amino acids present so that you don't run into that situation. I'm honestly not too worried about the catabolic anabolic steady state here. What I want to talk to you about here really is just kind of this boiled down into this figure, right? And this is part of what we've been talking about up to this point. The idea that we have these three major nutrients, proteins, carbs, and fats. And that on some level, right, we can kind of consider these to be roughly interchangeable pools of raw material, right? Fats, carbs, and proteins kind of as this raw material. For proteins, right, when we talk about metabolic processes here, our protein pool is usually used for building things, right? But, right, if need arises, right, we can back convert it to other things. We can turn it into fats. We can, I guess it sort of dire need, we could turn it into a carbohydrate. We have means of converting between the protein pool and the carb pool. And the same is true for carbs and fats and all these other things. We can convert in between each of these pools at need, but each of these pools is otherwise kind of set to its own destiny, right? Fats for the long-term storage of energy, carbohydrates for the short-term storage and usage of energy, and proteins for anabolic or building processes. What does become important for us here with this catabolic anabolic steady state is that because you are not an infant anymore and you are not more or less continuously feeding, the fact that you break up your meals into 3 discrete chunks within a day becomes important for us, right? And the reason that becomes important for us is that we can then divide our day up into an absorptive state and a post-absorptive state. So the absorptive state, right, is in the period immediately following us eating something, right, where we're actively absorbing nutrients. Okay, and that's 3 or 4 hours after every meal, right? So if you eat at 8 in the morning, you have breakfast 8 in the morning, you're in an absorptive state until noon, you have lunch. At noon, you're in an absorptive state from noon until 4. You have a couple of hours there, probably from 4 to 6, when you're in a post-absorptive state, right? And then at 6, you have dinner again, and you're in the absorptive state from 6 until 10. And then from 10 until 8 in the morning, you're going to be in a post-absorptive state yet again. Basically, the idea here is either you're actively putting nutrients away in the pantry, right, because you've got a whole bunch of them, or you're pulling them off the pantry to put them into use because you have no nutrients coming in. That's all this is about. Now, why this becomes such a big deal for us, right, is that there are some fairly important hormones that control kind of what we do in each of those states. And the reason that becomes important is that we don't want to have big wild fluctuations between post-absorptive and absorptive states. Think about blood sugar, right? Those stupid Snickers commercials, right? Talking about how, you know, if you have low blood sugar, you're grumpy or what have you. It's true, right? It really honestly is true. You can have all kinds of health swings that happen if you find yourself hypoglycemic, for example. So we want to avoid those, right? We want to not make sure that our, say, blood sugar doesn't get too high in the absorptive state and doesn't get too low in the post-absorptive state. And so we have hormones like insulin and glucagon that control kind of the putting away of extra glucose and the pulling of extra glucose off the shelf. So the peaks aren't so high and the valleys aren't so low. So the absorptive state is controlled by insulin. And insulin here is the putting it on the shelf, storing it for later hormone, right? We're going to take extra glucose, we're going to pull it out of the bloodstream, we're going to put it in the form of glycogen into the liver so that our blood sugar doesn't spike during a post-meal period. And then in the post-absorptive state, right, here we're going to have another hormone, excuse me, another hormone called glucagon, and we'll come back to those slides in a second. And glucagon here is when we're going to need glucose, when our blood glucose levels start to drop in this post-absorptive period. We're going to take all that glucose we just put on the shelf, and we're going to pull it out, right? And we're going to put it back out there into circulation so we don't run out of glucose. No. Sorry, I'm having some trouble here. Okay, so the most important thing here in this post-absorptive state is to maintain a relatively level amount of blood glucose between sort of post-absorptive and absorptive states. Again, just kind of trying to keep everything as even as possible, right? One of the things that is kind of surprising to people, perhaps, is that having a drink with dinner, right? So a beer, a glass of wine, what have you, during the meal actually has the effect of requiring you to use less insulin, right? Your blood glucose levels are kind of naturally going to be lower than they would otherwise be, right? So that can be something that we think about in terms of managing insulin issues, perhaps. I'm not worried about this. Oh, I'm honestly not worried about this either. In terms of overall metabolic processes here, right? Depending on what our age is, depending on what's happening in our body at a particular moment in time, we have lots and lots of other hormonal controls on metabolism here. So when you're young, right, you have growth hormone that's responsible for well, growth, right? So anabolic processes. When you are post-pubescent, your sex hormones take over that role. Take over that role for you. Thyroxine or thyroid hormone is a metabolic hormone. Thyroxine in the bloodstream increases metabolic rate. Okay, so things of that nature also will play a fairly important role in metabolic process. Okay, so we'll call that there. We'll come back on Wednesday when I'm not sneezing as often as possible. We'll come back, we'll finish up nutrition, and we'll move on to the urinary system from there. All right. Again, apologize for the kind of the makeshift kind of late notice on this kind of stuff, but it was one of those things that I was hoping to be not wheezy and red-eyed and bleary in the morning, and it just didn't happen. So that said, I will see you guys on Wednesday. Have a wonderful rest of your day.